June 18, 1943. 0410 hours. 30 kilometers south of Veliky Luki Eastern Front. The first Soviet mortar round hit the frozen treeline with a sharp white flash that lit the German forward position for a fraction of a second. The ground, frozen to a depth of 40 centimeters, vibrated as the shock waves moved through the soil. Corporal Klaus Richter stood inside a half-finished dugout, watching loose grains of frost fall from the timber above him. He did not flinch. He had experienced this pattern for weeks. The Soviets opened each morning with mortar fire targeted at the shallow German positions. Standard doctrine told the men to deepen their trenches, widen the timber support beams, and reinforce the overhead cover with cut logs. The men tried to obey, but the frozen earth stopped shovels and saw blades snapped in the cold. Mortar shells kept coming. The collapse rate kept rising. Each blast sent splinters and frozen soil into the air. Each collapse took another life. The battalion had suffered 27 killed in 8 days. Most were lost due to overhead failures in dugouts struck by 82mm and 120mm mortar rounds. The timber used to reinforce the ceilings had become brittle. Moisture trapped inside the logs froze and weakened their internal structure. Richter had watched 3 dugouts collapse in one morning. He saw a sergeant crushed under a beam that snapped clean in the middle. He saw men dig out comrades with bare hands until their fingers bled. He saw the fear in their eyes every time they entered a bunker. The overhead cover was supposed to keep them alive. Instead, it had become a risk. Richter had spent his civilian life in Bavaria managing a large commercial ice house. He oversaw the harvesting, storage, and delivery of ice for breweries. He worked with ice blocks every season. He understood how to cut them, move them, fuse them, and stack them without cracking. He knew the density of compacted ice. He knew how ice distributed force when struck. He knew that thick, uniform sheets of ice absorbed shock in a way timber could not. While most soldiers only saw frozen water, Richter saw a structural medium with properties that could be shaped and controlled. When he studied the collapsing dugouts, he saw that the overhead structures failed because the timber beams concentrated the force of impact along narrow load points. He knew ice behaved differently. It deformed. It dispersed energy. It compressed. It spread impact over a wider surface. It was a material the Eastern Front offered in abundance. During a lull in the shelling, Richter spoke to his platoon leader, Lieutenant Weber. Weber listened while brushing frost from his collar. Richter explained how large ice sheets could be cut from nearby frozen ponds. He explained how they could be reinforced with compacted snow and earth to create a wide, load-distributing roof. Weber heard him out but kept his hands in his pockets. He said ice was unpredictable. He said it would melt. He said it was not in the manuals. He told Richter to focus on standard timbering and to avoid experimental ideas. The conversation ended there. Weber walked away. Richter continued thinking. 2 days later, a direct mortar hit destroyed Dugout 6 and killed 5 men. The collapse was almost instant. The surviving troops stood in silence afterward. The air smelled of burnt powder and broken soil. A field surgeon shook his head and said the dugouts would kill more men than rifles. The company commander, Hauptmann Erich Müller, walked the line and saw the same pattern. The timber was snapping. The overhead supports were failing. There was no supply convoy bringing fresh beams. The men were cold, underfed, and unwilling to sleep under ceilings they no longer trusted. Richter approached Müller with the idea again. This time Müller listened. Richter explained how ice blocks were cut at his ice house in Bavaria. He said the ice could be shaped with axes and saws. He said they could stack layers to create a roof 30 to 40 centimeters thick. He said compacted snow between layers would fuse them together. He said a thin layer of soil on top would insulate the ice from direct sunlight. He outlined each step with technical precision. Müller watched him closely. He did not dismiss the idea. He had lost too many men to mortar collapses. He had no replacement timber. He needed a solution. He told Richter to test the idea on one bunker. If it held for 2 days of bombardment, he would consider a wider rollout. Richter gathered 7 men from his squad. They marched 1 kilometer to a shallow frozen lake at dawn. The temperature was minus 14 degrees Celsius. The ice was thick enough to hold a vehicle. Richter selected a section near the shoreline and instructed the men to cut rectangular blocks 1 meter long and 20 centimeters thick. They worked with axes and saws normally used for timbering. The tools worked slower on ice, but they worked. The blocks were heavy. 4 men carried each block using ropes fashioned into slings. They moved 28 blocks to the bunker site in 1 day. Richter directed the men to dig the roof cavity slightly deeper and flatten the support ledges on both sides. They laid the first row of ice blocks across the span. The blocks formed a solid surface. They packed compacted snow on top and pressed it into the seams. They waited for it to freeze. They repeated the process for a second layer. Then a third. The roof reached a density far greater than timber. They added a thin layer of soil and snow on top to regulate temperature. The final roof looked plain from the outside. No one would have guessed that half a ton of ice reinforced the overhead cover. Richter inspected every seam. He checked each load point. He made the men push from below to test weight distribution. The structure held firm. Later that night, 3 sergeants visited the site and shook their heads. One said it looked like a frozen barn. Another said the first warm day would destroy it. The third said Muller had lost his judgment. The men heard them, but they kept working. At 0536 hours the next morning, the Soviets began a mortar preparation across the entire sector. The rounds landed at predictable intervals. The first impact hit 30 meters east. The second hit 10 meters north. The third landed directly on the new bunker. The ice roof shook. Snow fell from the top layer. The structure did not crack. The men inside covered their ears and waited for collapse. It never came. The fourth round hit even closer. The sound was sharp and metallic. The shock wave pressed against the walls. Timber supports groaned. Richter crouched near the center of the bunker and watched the ice above him. He looked for fractures. He saw none. Only faint white lines where the layers had fused. The ice absorbed the blast. It compressed slightly, then released the pressure without breaking. The men stared upward with wide eyes. They had seen timber snap under far weaker hits. The absence of structural failure felt unnatural. The barrage continued for 9 minutes. Heavy 120mm rounds struck the area in groups of 3. Soil sprayed across the position. The dugout shook with every impact. When the silence finally returned, Richter opened the entrance hatch. The air outside smelled of burnt powder. Adjacent dugouts had taken direct hits. One had collapsed entirely. Men were digging frantically to reach survivors. Richter's bunker stood intact. The men inside walked out uninjured. Hauptmann Muller inspected the site within the hour. He removed his gloves and touched the ice layer where a fragment had embedded itself. He studied the deformation pattern on the surface. He saw how the ice had absorbed the blow. He knelt and pressed his palm to the roof. The surface was cold, smooth and solid. He nodded once. He told Richter to begin work on 2 more bunkers immediately. The order was clear. The experimental idea had moved to limited adoption. Richter and his squad returned to the frozen lake. They increased their output. They cut larger blocks. They used a 2-man saw to speed the process. They built a sled out of spare timber to move the blocks more efficiently. They began stacking the ice in formation at the site before installing it on the roof. They researched each layer for cracks. They learned how to fuse layers faster by using a mix of fine snow and water. They created a compacting system using boots and heavy planks to level each layer. Their efficiency grew with each bunker. The second bunker was completed in 1 day. The third in 18 hours. More men volunteered to assist once they saw the results firsthand. Soldiers who had mocked the idea earlier now asked questions. They inspected the ice seams. They watched how the men fused the layers. They asked about thickness, weight, and temperature stability. Richter answered each question with practical detail. He explained that ice density increased when fine snow filled microscopic gaps. He explained that compressive strength rose when layers froze into a single sheet. He explained that a thin soil layer slowed melting during daytime. By day 5, the company had 3 operational ice bunkers. Each had walls reinforced with timber but roofs built entirely from layered ice. The structures looked strange to officers accustomed to standard doctrine. They appeared too simple. They appeared too improvised. Yet they held. The Soviets resumed their bombardments each morning. Their artillery spotters had learned the exact coordinates of the German forward positions. Each barrage followed a pattern. First the 82mm mortars. Then heavier 120mm tubes. Then scattered artillery if available. The goal was to break down the defensive line before launching an infantry push. This tactic had worked repeatedly in the sector. Each day brought new casualties. Commanders became reluctant to place men in the dugouts at all. Many slept in shallow trenches instead. This increased exposure and lowered morale. The new ice bunkers changed behavior. Men began volunteering for night shifts inside them. They trusted the structure. They said the ceiling looked firm. They said the sound of impacts above them was less threatening. They said the ice absorbed the noise differently. They felt safer. Safety mattered. Morale shifted. On June 22, 1943 at 0502 hours, the Soviets launched one of their heaviest mortar barrages of the month. Reports estimated more than 100 rounds fired into the company's grid square within 40 minutes. One bunker built with timber collapsed after 2 direct hits. 2 men were killed instantly. 3 more were wounded. Another trench section was flattened. Crews raced to extract survivors. The ice bunkers continued to take hits. One received a direct impact from a 120mm round that would have shattered a timber roof instantly. The ice roof deformed. The top layer broke into fragments. The second and third layers held. Snow fell inside, but the structure did not fail. Muller stood outside during the strike, shouting orders over the noise. He watched the ice bunkers hold as everything else shook. After the barrage, he filed a field report noting reduced casualties in positions reinforced with ice. The report did not praise innovation. It simply listed results. 3 ice bunkers, 48 men sheltered across multiple barrages, 0 structural failures. He recommended expansion. Word spread across the battalion. Officers from neighboring companies visited the site to inspect the structures. Some dismissed the concept. Some requested construction instructions. Others requested Richter himself. He became the central figure in a small but growing tactical shift. He did not call it innovation. He said they were using whatever the environment provided. He said the ice sheets behaved predictably if cut and layered correctly. He said the frozen ground was a threat, but ice could be an asset. By early July, the company had expanded ice bunker construction to 6 locations. Supply shortages continued. Timber remained scarce. Ice was unlimited. Men adapted to the new system quickly. They used saws more often than hammers. They relied on blocks instead of beams. They fused layers instead of nailing planks. The method required more labor but fewer resources. As more bunkers appeared, Soviet spotters noticed new shapes under the snow. They adjusted aim. They tried repeated hits on the same coordinates. They attempted to collapse the structures by saturation. The roofs held. Impact after impact, the layers compressed, shifted, and refroze. The structural integrity remained stable. The soil cap prevented thawing in daylight. The frozen nights kept the layers hard. The infantry inside the bunkers experienced fewer injuries. Blast overpressure dropped. Fragment penetration through the roof ceased. The men slept longer. They ate without rushing. They planned patrols more calmly. A stable roof improved every aspect of their routine. Even hardened veterans admitted the difference. One afternoon, Richter's platoon gathered to test a damaged section of one bunker roof. They removed the top layer where a shell had hit directly. Underneath, the second layer showed a deep indentation. The third layer held smooth and solid. The impact energy had been spread across the entire surface. Timber never behaved that way. Ice did. Richter explained the mechanics again. He said ice redistributed force because it compressed uniformly. He said timber snapped because the load concentrated along grain lines. He said the ice roof converted shock into deformation. The men nodded. They understood enough to trust it. By mid-July, the battalion staff finally acknowledged the results. They recorded casualty statistics for the past 30 days. They noted that positions with traditional timber roofs suffered 9 structural failures under mortar fire. They noted that positions with ice-reinforced roofs suffered 0 failures. They saw the difference in survival rates. They saw the difference in readiness. They approved expansion across the sector. The order did not mention Richter by name, but everyone knew the origin. The expansion required coordination. Not every position had access to a frozen lake or pond. Some locations relied on compacted snow formed into slabs, then saturated with water at night to produce solid layers. Other units developed their own cutting methods. They built simple frames to shape blocks consistently. They created sleds and rail systems to move large quantities quickly. The process became more organized. What began as a desperate improvisation grew into a localized doctrine. Richter continued overseeing construction, but his responsibilities increased. Muller placed him in charge of training teams from other platoons. He instructed them on block dimensions, proper layer thickness, and seam preparation. He demonstrated how to apply compacted snow evenly. He showed them how to test for microfractures. He explained how to seal weak points with water that froze overnight. He emphasized maintaining a consistent temperature inside the bunker to prevent premature thawing. He insisted on correct placement of support ledges. His direction was practical and clear. The men listened because the results had already proven the method. The Eastern Front remained unforgiving. Daytime temperatures stayed below freezing in the region for most of the month. Nights dipped lower. Snowfall continued every few days. These conditions worked in their favor. The environment maintained the bunker roofs without additional effort. Each new barrage became a test. Each test reinforced the validity of the structure. On July 26, 1943 at 0448 hours, Soviet infantry began probing attacks supported by mortar fire. Their goal was to determine if the German trenches had weakened. They launched short, concentrated patterns of 82mm rounds. The sound echoed across the white fields. The ice bunkers absorbed the hits. Infantry patrols returned to their positions without casualties. Soviet units reported limited effect on the German line. Mortar teams increased their rate of fire. They failed to produce structural failures. The contrast with other companies became apparent. Units farther west lacking access to ice resources continued to rely on timber. They suffered higher casualties from indirect fire. Reports spread through regimental channels. Some officers questioned why ice structures had not been used earlier. Others argued that such methods were situational. They said the approach depended on weather conditions. They said ice was temporary. Meanwhile, Richter's sector continued holding with fewer losses. In early August, the temperatures briefly rose above freezing during the afternoon. This posed a new threat. Meltwater formed at the edges of some roofs. Richter inspected each bunker. He saw that the soil layer above the ice limited the rate of melt. He ordered additional snow to be packed around the perimeter. He ensured the entrances were reinforced with compacted drifts. When temperatures dropped again at night, the melt refroze. The structure stabilized. None of the bunkers failed. During this period, Richter wrote short field notes for Muller. He described the strengths and limitations of the ice roofs. He stated that the method depended on night frost to maintain integrity. He noted that a layer thickness under 20 centimeters weakened resistance. He suggested alternate reinforcement options for warmer weeks, including adding timber cross braces under the ice. Muller forwarded the notes to the battalion staff. The staff copied the information and included it in their informal defensive guidelines. The ice method gained recognition as a tactical improvisation worth preserving, even if it remained a temporary adaptation. The Soviets soon recognized that something had changed. Their mortar teams increased accuracy. They adjusted aim. They focused on known strong points. Yet the bunkers continued holding. A captured Soviet soldier later claimed they believed the Germans had installed steel plates or reinforced concrete. He said they could not understand how dugouts survived so many direct hits. He said their commanders suspected deception. None imagined layered ice. During one barrage on August 11, a 120mm round hit the top of Bunker 3 with a force strong enough to send soil 30 meters into the air. Richter was inside supervising repairs when it hit. The blast knocked him against the wall. Dust and snow filled the air. The roof shook violently. When the shaking stopped, he checked the ceiling. The topmost layer had shattered. Small fragments fell across the floor. The second layer had cracked but remained intact. The third layer held perfectly. The roof had absorbed the blast, deformed, and preserved structural stability. He called for immediate reinforcement. The men replaced the damaged top layer with new blocks by nightfall. The bunker returned to full strength before dawn. Incidents like this further solidified the method's credibility. The men saw the roofs withstand conditions that would have destroyed standard structures. They gained confidence. They carried themselves with more certainty. They believed they had a chance to survive the next barrage. Fear never disappeared, but it decreased. Throughout August, Richter continued refining the process. He discovered that blocks cut in the early morning were stronger due to lower temperatures. He observed that thinner layers fused faster. He learned that a mix of coarse snow and fine snow produced better bonding. He experimented with staggered layering patterns that increased stability across wide spans. He documented these findings and passed them to other units. His notes were clear and practical. Muller eventually informed him that battalion command wanted to meet him. The meeting occurred under a small command tent. Maps covered the table. A kerosene heater flickered in the corner. 2 staff officers greeted him. They asked about his background. He explained his work at the ice house in Bavaria. He described the harvesting process. He explained that his team had handled thousands of tons of ice each winter. The officers asked about the physics. He explained compression, load distribution, and deformation under impact. They asked about long-term reliability. He said it depended on weather, but the current conditions supported the method. They thanked him. They said his contribution had reduced casualties. They said his knowledge had been noted. Richter did not react with pride. He saw the method as simple necessity. He said the men needed roofs that did not kill them. He said the ice had always been there. They had only used it correctly. The officers nodded. They dismissed him. Across the sector, the Soviets attempted another major push on August 18. Mortar barrages preceded the assault. Several small trenches were destroyed. But the ice bunkers again survived. Infantry inside emerged without injuries and reinforced the line. The Soviet assault stalled. Analysts later noted that reduced German casualties during the bombardment phase contributed to holding the position. They noted that morale had remained stable. They noted that the defensive line did not crack. By late August, the weather grew colder again. The bunkers grew even stronger. The thicker the ice, the more effective the structure became. Men joked that nature had become their engineer. Richter said nothing. He focused on maintenance. He checked each roof daily. He ordered repairs when necessary. He maintained discipline. September arrived with colder winds sweeping across the tree line. Frost formed earlier each evening. Snow accumulated in thin layers over the soil cap on every bunker. These conditions stabilized the structures further. The ice roofs grew denser. Small cracks sealed themselves each night as moisture refroze. Richter saw that the structures had reached their strongest state. The men noticed it too. They no longer hesitated when entering the bunkers. They slept longer without waking during distant artillery fire. They trusted the integrity of the overhead cover. During the first week of September, several new officers rotated into the sector. They inspected each defensive position and took notes. When they reached the ice bunkers, they reacted with visible confusion. Some had never seen such structures. They tapped the roofs with rifle butts. They scraped away soil to examine the layers. They questioned Richter repeatedly. They wanted to know thickness, sourcing, and construction time. He answered each question directly. He gave rough measurements. He explained the layering method. He repeated the fact that the design depended on freezing temperatures. Some officers nodded in approval. Others raised concerns. They said the method could not be standardized. They said it was too dependent on conditions. They said it lacked official doctrine. Despite this skepticism, results continued to guide decisions. The battalion recorded weekly casualty tallies. Positions without ice reinforcement still suffered collapses. Positions with ice reinforcement recorded none. The contrast remained clear. Commanders prioritized survival over orthodoxy. Improvised solutions often produced measurable advantages. This case was no exception. The Soviets adapted. Spotters observed that the German line was absorbing indirect fire better than before. They altered tactics. They shifted focus to flanking positions. They increased the use of artillery instead of mortars. But artillery ammunition was limited in the region. Mortars remained their primary asset. Mortars continued to dominate the battlefield each morning. Mortars continued to hit Richter's sector. Mortars continued to fail to collapse his bunkers. On September 12, a heavy bombardment began shortly after 0500 hours. Reports estimated more than 140 rounds fired into the grid. Several dugouts constructed by neighboring companies collapsed. Medical teams worked through the morning to extract survivors. Richter's bunkers took direct hits on 4 separate roofs. 2 top layers shattered. 1 support edge cracked. Yet the structural cores held. Not a single man inside was killed or seriously wounded. Muller documented the incident. He emphasized the difference in outcomes. Commanders read the report carefully. The influence of Richter's method expanded beyond immediate positions. Units from adjacent companies requested instruction. Small teams walked to his sector to watch construction firsthand. They took notes on tools, block sizes, and ice handling. They copied his layering technique. Some added modifications. One unit mixed crushed snow with soil to create a more stable top coating. Another unit used wooden planks as temporary braces while installing ice blocks, removing them once the layers froze. Each adaptation stemmed from practical need. The method spread organically. Richter continued training men daily. He taught them while standing in the snow with his gloves off to demonstrate cuts and seams. He used simple terms. He said to keep the blocks even. He said to maintain uniform thickness. He said to watch for fractures. He never complicated the process. He focused on what worked. His authority came from proven results, not rank. Meanwhile, Soviet patrols attempted night infiltration on several occasions to identify weaknesses. They found few. They observed that the German bunkers had shifted appearance. They reported unfamiliar construction. They saw new defensive patterns. Their commanders noted the changes. They suspected hidden reinforcements. They planned heavier bombardments to break the line. Their efforts did not succeed. By late September, the sector recorded a reduction in fatal overhead collapses by more than 80% compared to June. This shift affected more than survival rates. It influenced how the men fought. Soldiers inside stable bunkers exited faster after bombardments. They prepared for counterattacks more effectively. They maintained higher readiness. They reacted to Soviet advances with stronger cohesion. The defensive posture improved across the line. On September 23, a battalion engineering officer visited the sector for a full assessment. He examined each bunker. He took measurements. He asked detailed questions about construction time, manpower usage, and resource availability. Richter provided estimates. He said it required 8 to 10 men to build a full roof in one day. He said block transport depended on distance. He said freezing conditions were the main requirement. The officer recorded every detail. He left with a clear impression of the method's viability. Later that week, a regimental staff briefing referenced the ice reinforcement technique. The briefing noted that the approach increased survivability in frozen sectors. It stated that the method was not formally approved but could be implemented at commander discretion. It emphasized that conditions mattered. It recommended further observation. This was the closest the method would come to official recognition. During early October, the weather dipped again. Temperatures reached levels that hardened the ice roofs beyond their summer density. Mortar rounds struck the bunkers with duller impact sounds. The men noticed the difference. They said the blasts felt muted. They said the structures felt immovable. Richter confirmed that the lower temperatures improved structural stability. He said each layer was now at maximum hardness. He instructed teams to add reinforcement only if cracks appeared. On October 9, Soviet units launched a strong infantry attack supported by combined mortar and artillery fire. The assault targeted 3 adjacent German positions, including 2 ice bunkers recently completed by newly trained squads. The bombardment lasted 20 minutes. Several timber dugouts collapsed. The ice bunkers did not. When the Soviet infantry advanced, the German defenders emerged in greater numbers than expected. They held the line until reinforcements arrived. After the engagement, several officers commented that the ice structures had preserved key rifle squads during the bombardment phase. They linked this directly to the successful defense. Soviet documents captured later revealed that their commanders observed the increased German resistance. They noted the reduced effect of mortar bombardment. They speculated that the Germans had secretly reinforced their positions with machinery or prefabricated materials. They did not consider ice. Their intelligence reports misinterpreted visual signs such as soil caps and smooth roof surfaces. Throughout the month, Richter continued refining his technique. He experimented with varying layer counts. He tested 4-layer roofs on one structure. He tested thicker layers on another. He measured the time required for fusion. He compared the performance of slabs cut at different times of day. He documented each result. He remained focused on practical application. He did not seek recognition. By late October, the battalion had 16 ice-reinforced bunkers in operation. Some were large enough to shelter full squads. Others served as storage points for ammunition and rations. All of them contributed to reduced losses. All of them demonstrated the same pattern. They held under fire. As the month ended, a senior officer visited the site. He conducted a formal inspection. He questioned Richter about long-term durability. He asked if the structures could survive until spring. Richter answered plainly. He said the roofs were temporary. He said they were designed for winter. He said thawing would weaken them. He said the method was a seasonal adaptation. The officer accepted the explanation. He said that winter solutions were still solutions. He said immediate survival mattered more than future uncertainty. By early November, snowfall increased. Ice production accelerated. The bunkers reached their strongest phase again. Soviet bombardments continued but lost their previous level of effectiveness. The line held. The first major freeze of November strengthened the bunker roofs beyond anything Richter had anticipated. Nighttime temperatures reached -20 degrees Celsius. The ice layers fused into a near monolithic sheet. Men knocked on the roofs and said they felt like stone. The sound changed. Impacts became dull and heavy. The structural behavior improved with every drop in temperature. Richter inspected the bunkers daily. He confirmed that the cold was working in their favor. He added minor reinforcements only to entrances and ventilation shafts. On November 11, Soviet mortar teams shifted patterns again. They fired in staggered waves. They attempted to hit the same point repeatedly to induce structural fatigue. The impacts shook snow from the surrounding trees. The ice roofs bore the strain without visible deformation. One bunker took 5 consecutive hits in the same area. The top layer cracked. The second layer compressed. The third remained stable. The structure held. The men inside remained unharmed. Reports from adjacent sectors continued to highlight the contrast. Units without ice bunkers suffered regular casualties from collapses. Commanders in those areas requested additional timber. Supply lines could not meet the demand. Winter slowed transport. Vehicles froze overnight. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Improvised construction remained the only viable option. Richter's method provided one of the few effective solutions available. As more officers visited his sector, they observed the consistency of results. They studied the bunkers under daylight. They examined the roof edges. They observed no sagging. They observed no warping. They observed no catastrophic failures despite weeks of continuous bombardment. The method proved durable. The method required only labor, ice, and cold. These conditions existed across the Eastern Front. On November 16, a field engineer conducted an informal stress test. He asked Richter if he could strike the roof with an entrenching tool. Richter permitted it. The engineer struck the surface 3 times. The ice did not crack. It dented slightly. The dent refroze within hours. The engineer recorded his observations. He said the roof behaved like a shock-absorbing plate. He said the method was a valid countermeasure against indirect fire under winter conditions. His assessment circulated through engineering channels. Despite increasing acceptance, opposition still existed among some officers. They argued that temporary structures wasted manpower. They said men should focus on ammunition handling and trench rotation. They said the method had no long-term value. Muller ignored these objections. He saw the casualty reports. He saw the improved morale. He saw the operational stability. He continued supporting construction. As December approached, snowfall intensified. The ice roofs grew thicker automatically. Moisture from the air froze on contact. The soil caps became harder. The bunkers blended into the landscape. Spotters could not distinguish them from natural terrain. This reduced the accuracy of enemy fire. One Soviet mortar team later reported they lost visual indicators of dugout placement during winter months. They fired blind. Their accuracy dropped. German survival rates improved even further. On December 3, a major Soviet bombardment targeted the entire battalion line. Reports estimated nearly 200 mortar rounds in 50 minutes. Several timbered dugouts in adjacent sectors collapsed. Casualty teams operated through the night. In Richter's sector, 6 bunkers took direct hits. 3 lost their top layers. 1 lost 2 layers. All survived. Men walked out alive. Muller submitted another report. He noted 0 structural failures. He highlighted the continued effectiveness of the method. This bombardment drew the attention of divisional staff. They requested an assessment. A small engineering group arrived on December 7. They interviewed Richter. They examined the structures. They analyzed construction time. They examined ice density. They recorded air temperatures. They asked about resource strain. Richter answered all questions plainly. He said the method required labor but saved lives. He said the environment provided the materials. He said the structures had not collapsed under any barrage. The engineers produced a short summary. They stated the method was an effective winter reinforcement. They submitted the summary to divisional command. No formal directive followed. The front was collapsing in other areas. The division had larger concerns. As December advanced, Soviet units prepared for winter offensives. Mortar fire intensified. Pressure increased. Yet the bunkers continued holding. The men in Richter's platoon began to rely on them for planning rather than just shelter. They stored ammunition inside. They wrote field notes inside. They briefed patrols inside. The bunkers had become part of daily routine. Their reliability shaped operations. One freezing evening, Richter stood outside Bunker 4 with Muller. Snowflakes drifted through the air. The wind carried distant artillery sounds. Muller told Richter that his contribution had saved many men. Richter said they had simply used what was available. Muller said that was the point. Necessity had produced the method. Richter remained silent. The Soviet attack on December 14 tested the bunkers again. Mortar fire struck the line for nearly an hour. Infantry advanced behind the barrage. Several trenches collapsed. 2 machine gun nests were destroyed, but the bunkers remained intact. Infantry inside emerged quickly and reinforced weakened positions. The line held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Analysts later credited bunker survivability as a key factor. Richter continued training new units through December. Some were replacement troops recently arrived from Germany. They had never seen such structures. They asked how ice could stop a mortar. Richter demonstrated. He showed them fragments embedded in the top layer. He showed them deformation marks on the second layer. He explained the load distribution. He turned practical knowledge into simple instruction. The new men understood. They trusted the method. By late December, the sector had 19 operational ice-reinforced bunkers. Several were in continuous use for more than 4 months. The men reported no major failures. They reported only surface damage. Richter ensured all repairs were immediate. He maintained a strict inspection schedule. He enforced discipline even as winter hardened the structures further. The final month of the year saw heavy losses across the Eastern Front. Supply shortages intensified. The line weakened in several regions. But Richter's sector remained comparatively stable. Reduced mortar casualties preserved manpower. Preserved manpower strengthened defensive readiness. Leadership noted the pattern. Informal recognition grew. Richter himself remained unchanged. He took no credit. He continued working with the same consistency as the first day he proposed the idea. He walked the line. He inspected each bunker. He corrected errors. He trained men. He adapted to conditions. His role grew gradually but never formally. As January approached, temperatures remained low. The ice bunkers reached peak hardness. They were more resilient than at any previous point. The men joked that nothing short of artillery could break them. They were correct. January brought the coldest stretch of the winter. Night temperatures reached levels that froze exposed metal. Rifle bolts locked. Water cans split. Breath crystallized in the air. The ice bunkers thrived under these conditions. Each structure gained density as moisture in the soil cap froze deeper. Richter inspected the roofs daily. He confirmed each layer remained solid. He reinforced entrances only when drifting snow blocked access. No other maintenance was needed. On January 9th, the Soviets launched a concentrated mortar and artillery preparation before attempting a breakthrough. The bombardment shook the entire sector. Several trenches collapsed instantly. A machine gun post was destroyed. A supply shelter burned. But the ice bunkers absorbed the hits. One bunker took repeated strikes from both mortars and field guns. The top layer shattered. The second layer cracked in multiple places. The third layer held. The structure stayed intact long enough for the men to exit and reinforce a collapsing flank. The line held through the day. Reports afterward credited the bunkers for preserving one of the rifle squads that later prevented a Soviet penetration attempt. By mid-January, the battalion submitted updated casualty figures. In 7 months, positions using Richter's method suffered no fatalities from overhead collapse. Positions without ice reinforcements suffered more than 60. Leadership noted this contrast. They understood the impact. They did not formalize the method. They simply allowed every commander to decide. Conditions varied across the front. Only frozen sectors could use it. But in those sectors, results remained consistent. As winter continued, Richter's reputation spread quietly. He became the point of contact for any unit seeking guidance on bunker reinforcement. He trained men from other battalions. He showed them the process. He repeated the same steps each time. Cut early in the morning. Maintain uniform thickness. Use compacted snow to fuse layers. Keep soil thin but even. Inspect seams. Repair immediately after hits. His instructions were simple. His authority came from results, not rank. By February the front shifted. Orders arrived for withdrawal to secondary positions. The sector that had used the ice bunkers for months began dismantling equipment. Men moved ammunition and rations. They abandoned some bunkers in place. The ice structures remained standing. They would melt in spring, leaving no trace. Their purpose was fulfilled. As the battalion withdrew, Muller walked with Richter one last time along the old line. Snow covered everything. The bunkers blended into the terrain. Muller told him that men had survived because he refused to accept standard doctrine. Richter said they had survived because they worked together. Muller acknowledged him with a short nod. No formal commendation followed. The war continued. Recognition remained limited. After the war, Richter returned to Bavaria. He managed a small storage facility. He seldom spoke of his time on the front. Few people knew that his knowledge from an ice house had saved dozens of men. The method he created never appeared in manuals. It remained a local adaptation born from necessity, used effectively for one harsh winter, then forgotten by most who had not seen it. Yet the men who served in that sector remembered. They remembered the bunkers that did not collapse. They remembered the winter when mortar fire lost its usual certainty. They remembered the one soldier who understood ice better than doctrine. They survived because his insight became action.